March 1940. In London, the thunder of air raid sirens is still an occasional shock, not yet the nightly rhythm it will become. But inside the Admiralty, another sound is more terrifying than any aircraft engine: the dry rustle of paper. Tables covered in convoy reports. Columns of tonnage lost. Names of ships that left Halifax or Liverpool and never checked in again. Every few days the same message appears in different words. Another convoy attacked. Another gap in the escort screen exploited. Another set of merchant hulls gone somewhere in the grey emptiness of the Atlantic. Admiral Carl Donnett's submarines are turning commercial sea lanes into hunting grounds, and the Royal Navy has a very simple, very painful problem. There are not enough ships to stand between those submarines and Britain's lifeline. In one of those rooms sits Winston Churchill, recently returned to the Admiralty as First Lord. He reads the numbers with a clarity most men would rather avoid. Hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping lost per month. Only about 200 proper escort vessels available to cover routes that run from North America to Iceland, from West Africa to the British Isles. Behind every number is food, fuel, steel, and the ability of the country to keep fighting for another week. On paper, the answer seems obvious. Build more destroyers. They are the workhorses of the fleet. Fast, heavily armed, well known to every naval officer. The trouble is that the calculator does not care about tradition. A single modern destroyer takes a year and a half to build and costs enough to fund a small fleet of merchant ships. Britain's major naval yards are already working at full stretch. Every new order has a delivery date far out on a calendar the country might never reach. Churchill's memos become increasingly sharp. He stops talking about ideal fleets and starts talking about survival. In one short note, he writes a line that slices through a century of naval pride. What we require now are hulls in the water, not sophisticated vessels in 2 years' time. It is both a criticism and a challenge. If destroyers are too slow and too expensive to be the main answer, what else can take their place? Outside the big dockyards, in smaller commercial yards that usually build trawlers and coastal freighters, another kind of thinking is underway. Naval architects know that the ocean does not care if a ship is beautiful or graceful. It cares only whether the hull floats, moves, and can carry the tools needed for its job. Somewhere between a fishing vessel and a warship lies a design that might be just good enough to save convoys without bankrupting the country. The idea will look like a step backward to some. It will be slower than a destroyer, less impressive in silhouette, rougher in how it treats its crew. But in a war where merchant ships are disappearing every week, the question is no longer what is the best escort we can imagine. It is what can we build in large numbers, right now, with the tools and people we already have. That question leads directly to a class of ships named after garden flowers. They are short, stubby, and often uncomfortable. They lack glamour and polish. Yet by the end of the war, these modest corvettes will be credited with helping to sink far more submarines than the sleek destroyers that dominated pre-war thinking. And they will do it while costing roughly 1/10 as much. To understand why that trade-off worked, you have to start with the ship that seemed like the obvious solution, the fleet destroyer. In the late 1930s, a British destroyer was a showcase of naval engineering. Long and lean, with a sharp bow and graceful lines, it could sprint across the ocean at over 30 knots. Multiple gun mounts, banks of torpedo tubes, modern fire control systems, and powerful radar in later years made it a formidable presence in any surface action. The price for that capability was complexity. Everything about such a ship required the best resources the country could muster. The hull needed high-grade naval steel shaped in large, specialized yards. The propulsion system depended on precision-built steam turbines and elaborate boiler rooms. Electrical networks, pumps, communication systems. Each subsystem had its own supply chain, and any delay in any one part could slow the entire construction schedule. On the financial side, the picture was equally stark. Building one destroyer consumed funds equivalent to a large factory or a whole flotilla of smaller vessels. In calm peacetime budgets, that might be acceptable. In a war where losses at sea were already outpacing new production, it became dangerous arithmetic. Every destroyer ordered meant months of waiting and the use of a rare dock that might otherwise be turning out several simple ships in the same period. Worse yet, the destroyer's strengths did not align perfectly with the new reality of the Atlantic. Many of them had been conceived with fleet actions in mind, screening battleships, launching torpedoes at enemy cruisers, fighting in company with other large units. Chasing submarines in bad weather, far from bases, for weeks on end, alongside slow merchantmen, was a different task. Speed was useful, but only if you had enough ships to cover the huge surface of an ocean convoy. Naval planners began to realize that they were facing a geometric problem. A convoy might stretch for miles. A handful of fast escorts could dash to one threatened sector, only to leave another side exposed. German submarine commanders knew how to exploit such gaps. The answer was not a single perfect ship, but a screen thick enough that a hidden attacker would struggle to find a safe path to the merchant ships at all. That is the context in which a seemingly modest proposal appears. Instead of designing a new type of warship from scratch, some architects suggest starting from something the commercial world already understands: the rugged hulls used for whaling and fishing in rough northern waters. Those vessels are made to survive storms with minimal fuss. They are built in quantity by yards that have never laid down a destroyer. Their engines and fittings are familiar to civilian shipbuilders, not just naval specialists. If such a hull can be given a sonar set, a simple gun, racks for depth charges, and enough range to cross the Atlantic, it might become exactly the kind of escort Churchill is asking for: functional, affordable, and quick to produce. It will not impress visitors at a fleet review. It will not chase down raiders at high speed or stand in a battle line. But it does not need to. Its job is more focused and more brutal. Stay with a convoy, find submarines, and make attacking them as difficult and costly as possible. Once that mental shift happens, away from best in class and toward good enough in large numbers, a new type of ship becomes thinkable. The name chosen for the class, drawn from flowers rather than ancient naval heroes, is almost ironic. These vessels will work in some of the harshest seas on Earth. Their crews will call them many things, some unprintable, but history will remember them by those gentle names: Bluebell, Gladiolus, Campanula, and dozens more. The design staff now faces a different challenge: not how to squeeze the last knot of speed from a hull, but how to draw something so simple that any competent yard can build it with tools already on hand. That simplicity is going to be worth more to Britain's survival than the most advanced destroyer design in the world. The blueprint that finally moves from drawing board to steel is not born in an admiral's office at all. It grows out of the commercial world, from the lines of a whaling ship that has already proven itself in rough seas. The hull is short compared to its beam. It is not fast by naval standards, but it is tough, and its shape gives it a kind of stubborn buoyancy that trade captains appreciate when the weather turns hostile. Naval constructor teams strip out the whaling equipment and start adding what the war requires. At just over 200 feet long, with a single propeller and a simple steam plant, the new vessel is small by ocean standards. The engine is not a sleek turbine but a triple expansion unit, the sort of machine found in countless merchant ships, tugboats, and coastal craft. Workshops in multiple cities already know how to build and maintain such engines. Spare parts are plentiful. Training fitters to work on them is straightforward. The hull plating is commercial-grade steel fixed with rivets, not high-precision welded joints. For a warship designed to fight other surface combatants, that might be a problem. For a vessel whose main enemy prefers to hide underwater, it is acceptable. The sonar dome under the bow, the racks for depth charges on the stern, and the platform for a forward gun all bolt onto this sturdy, almost workman-like base. Most importantly, the design is drawn so that a yard familiar with fishing trawlers can adapt to it with minimal delay. The tools are the same. The skills are the same. Instead of laying out space for net lockers and refrigerated holds, workers build mess decks and ammunition stores. Where a whaler might carry blubber tanks, this ship carries extra fuel, allowing it to stay with convoys for long crossings. Because the hull is compact and the machinery simple, the timeline from keel to sea trial shrinks dramatically compared to a destroyer. A yard that might hand over a single complex combat ship in a year and a half can see 2 or 3 corvettes slide down the ways in the same span, and that is before smaller yards enter the picture. When those are counted, the flow of new hulls increases further. The cost reflects this simplicity. Every major component can be priced in terms familiar to commercial accountants rather than top-secret naval procurement officers. The result is roughly 1/10 the bill for a modern destroyer. For the same investment, the Admiralty can look forward not to one shining ship, but to a line of practical escorts, each able to take station at the flank of a convoy. Not everyone is convinced at first. Some senior officers look at the stubby profile and slow stated speed and protest that such vessels can never replace proper warships. They are right, but also missing the point. The corvette is not meant to take part in grand fleet actions. It is meant to multiply the number of escort silhouettes appearing on an enemy periscope, forcing U-boat captains to think twice before lining up an attack. As contracts are signed and steel ordered, A quiet revolution spreads through Britain's coastal towns. Yards that once built coasters for the Baltic or trawlers for the North Sea now find themselves working on ships that will sail under the white ensign. Workers who have never set foot on a naval base are suddenly part of the country's battle for survival. For many of them, the first corvette they complete will be the only warship they ever build, yet its impact may do more to shape the Atlantic War than some proud cruiser laid down in a famous dock. While the first corvettes are taking shape on rust-stained slipways, the ocean continues to show why they are needed. German submarine doctrine has evolved beyond the lone hunter model of earlier conflicts. Instead of a single boat stalking its target, several work together in coordinated groups. One patrol craft spots a convoy and shadows it, sending contact reports. Others race toward the reported position, adjusting course by radio until enough are in place to launch a group attack. When that moment comes, the geometry of the battlefield turns deadly for under-escorted convoys. At night, on the surface, the U-boats can move quickly, using their diesel engines to position themselves on different bearings. When they are ready, multiple torpedoes streak in from several directions in a short window of time. Even the fastest destroyer cannot be everywhere at once. It may pursue one contact, only to leave a gap through which another submarine can send its own salvo. Early convoys with only one or two escorts learn this lesson in the harshest way. A captain on an escort sees the flash of an explosion in the distance and races toward it, sonar pinging, crew already at the depth charge stations. Before his ship has gone halfway, another strike occurs at the opposite flank, then another. He can chase one sound of trouble or another, but never both. The result is a pattern of isolated reactions rather than consistent protection. Churchill and his sea commanders understand that this cannot continue. The country cannot afford to lose multiple ships in a single night to each wolf pack. It is not enough to have faster escorts or better weapons. They need more holes in the water, enough to form an outer ring and inner ring around the convoy, enough to ensure that any submarine trying to slip into launch position will have to pass within range of sonar and depth charges. This is where the corvette's true value becomes apparent. A single unit may be slower than a destroyer and carry fewer guns, but it still presents a sonar beam, a set of listening devices, and a cluster of depth charges ready to roll. When 6 or 8 such ships are spread around a convoy, the picture changes. Now, an attacking U-boat must account not for 1 or 2 escorts but for a network of patrol tracks. As the first Flower-class hulls finish trials and are assigned to escort groups, commanders begin reorganizing their defense schemes. Convoys that once had only a pair of sleek grey shapes alongside them now find a motley collection of silhouettes, perhaps a destroyer leading, a sloop on the quarter, and several corvettes forming a moving barrier. Each may not be impressive alone, but together they cover more approaches. From the submarine's point of view, this shifts the odds. The safer surface approach becomes riskier when multiple sets of eyes and ears are watching. Diving early to avoid detection means losing speed and the ability to reposition easily. The very presence of extra escorts, even if they are not as formidable individually as a destroyer, forces German commanders to make harder choices. The Atlantic is vast and no escort scheme will ever be perfect. Some convoys will still be caught at awkward moments, in bad weather or in regions where the escort strength has not yet reached desired levels. But with each new corvette joining the screen, the gaps tighten. The question is not whether any individual ship is superior, but whether the overall pattern is dense enough that U-boats no longer find the easy openings they enjoyed in the early months of the war. From a distance, a Flower-class corvette looks almost cheerful. The bow kicks up spray as it climbs each wave. A painted flower on the ship's crest gives it an almost friendly identity. Up close, and especially from the inside, the impression is very different. Life aboard such a vessel is a lesson in endurance. The hull form that makes the corvette so buoyant also gives it a particular motion in heavy seas. Instead of slicing through swell like a long destroyer, it tends to ride over each wave, lifting and dropping in a steady rhythm. In calm weather, this is merely uncomfortable. In the North Atlantic winter, with wind and swell working together, it turns the ship into a constantly moving platform. Stories from crews describe the same pattern: mugs sliding across tables, hammocks swinging so violently that sleep becomes an exercise in timing, and the sensation of walking uphill and downhill in the passageways every few seconds. Accommodation was originally designed for fewer men than war would eventually cram on board. Additional sonar operators, signalers, extra gun crews, each new piece of equipment demanded people to operate it, and those people needed bunk somewhere. The solution, more often than not, was to squeeze more into existing compartments. Privacy was a luxury. Dry clothes and quiet corners were even rarer. Heat was another problem. The North Atlantic does not forgive poor insulation, and these ships were built for speed of construction, not comfort. Small stoves provided some warmth, but they were of little help on open bridge wings where lookouts stood watch with sea spray freezing on their coats. Rain gear, once soaked with salt water, dried slowly if at all. Many sailors spent their entire watch system slightly damp and chilled, even when they were supposed to be resting. Yet it is precisely this willingness to endure discomfort that allowed the corvette crews to do what strategy required of them: spend more hours at sea than almost any other type of ship. Their engines, though old-fashioned in design, were robust and comparatively easy to maintain. Simple systems meant fewer specialized repairs. Turnaround times in harbor could be short. Convoys needed escorts, and these ships were available. Over time, a particular type of crew culture developed on the Flowers. Officers and ratings learned to manage the ship's quirks, how to set speed and heading to reduce rolling in marginal conditions, how to organize watch rotors to give exhausted men at least some proper rest, how to make a tiny mess feel like a temporary home. Shared hardship can damage morale if men feel it has no purpose. On corvettes, the purpose was never in doubt: staying between the convoy and the enemy. That clarity gave them a kind of quiet pride. They knew their ship looked odd beside a smart destroyer. They knew visiting staff officers sometimes called them halfway to hell in private. But they also knew that when a convoy sailed on time with full escort, it was often because their little ship was ready to go. They understood that their hours of seasickness, sleeplessness, and cold were part of the price the country paid to keep its trade moving. From the German side, the comfort level on board these vessels was irrelevant. What mattered was that on one night after another, somewhere on the horizon, there would be a small, stubborn silhouette with a sonar set pinging into the dark, making the ocean feel narrower than it used to. If the corvette's build philosophy was simple, its combat role demanded careful technique. Against a submarine, speed is only one factor. Information matters more: where the target is, what it is doing, and how it reacts under pressure. The tools available to corvette crews were basic but effective when used with discipline. The primary instrument was sonar, known at the time as ASDIC. A transducer mounted in a dome beneath the bow sent out sound pulses and listened for echoes returning from submerged objects. Operating it required training and patience. The operator had to distinguish between returns from the seabed, schools of fish, and the hard, compact shape of a submarine hull. Sea conditions, temperature layers, and ship speed could all influence the clarity of the echo. Once a contact was held, the ship had to maneuver in a way that turned information into action. A single corvette could make a run across the estimated position, dropping a pattern of depth charges set to explode at different depths. The charges themselves were simple steel cylinders with explosive filling and a trigger that fired when water pressure reached a certain level. Individual explosions might not strike directly, but repeated patterns could damage or disable a submarine, forcing it to surface or sink. In practice, it rarely remained a duel between one corvette and one U-boat. Escorts worked as a team. One ship might hold contact and direct others by signal or radio. Another might position itself to block the most likely escape path. The goal was not always immediate destruction. Sometimes the aim was to keep the submarine down, away from periscope depth, exhausting its batteries and air so that it would have to break off the attack. This created a new kind of pressure on the German crews. In earlier campaigns, they could fire a salvo and then dive to relative safety, slipping away once the initial search passed. As corvettes became more numerous and escort groups more practiced, the chances of such easy escapes diminished. A detected U-boat might find itself in a box of converging search patterns, with sonar pings coming from different bearings and depth charges falling in sequence. From the surface observer's point of view, these actions produced only brief signs: columns of white water, a smell of cordite in the air, perhaps some oil rising to the surface. For the crews of the corvettes, they were the result of drilled routines. Men who only months earlier had worked on fishing boats or in warehouses now stood at sonar consoles and release levers, translating bearings and range estimates into time drops. Over the months, reports began to accumulate. A corvette engages a contact near Iceland. Later analysis confirms the loss of a U-boat. Another group drives a submarine away from a convoy, then picks up a faint echo again hours later and completes the job. Each successful engagement is a small event in a long war, but the pattern is unmistakable. The slow, sturdy little ships are no longer just obstacles. They are hunters in their own right. None of this means that every attack leads to a confirmed success. Many depth charge patterns end with uncertainty. Oil on the surface might signal a damaged boat slipping away. Crews learn to be modest in their claims. But even when a submarine escapes, it has been forced to break off its approach to the convoy. Every attack avoided is a cargo saved, and in the arithmetic of the Atlantic, that result matters as much as a tally of enemy hulls destroyed. Behind the tactics and the daily strain lies a colder set of numbers that reveal why the Corvette strategy proved so powerful. When a Flower-class ship was lost to torpedoes or mines, the loss was tragic for the families of those on board, but the impact on Britain's overall war economy was contained. The financial cost was limited. The shipyard capacity required to replace it was manageable. Within months, another hull could be launched, often from the same yard. For Germany, each submarine represented a larger concentration of scarce resources. Building a U-boat meant committing high-grade steel, precision components, and the time of specialized engineers. More importantly, it meant training and assigning a crew whose skills could not be improvised. Navigators, engineers, and commanders needed months of schooling and practice before they were considered ready for Atlantic patrols. As corvette numbers grew, so did their share of successful anti-submarine actions. By mid-war, records show that small escorts were involved in a large fraction of confirmed U-boat losses, either alone or in cooperation with other vessels and aircraft. Every time a U-boat failed to return, Donitz and his staff faced a difficult reality. Replacing that unit would take time that Germany no longer had in abundance. From the British perspective, the exchange rate was slowly tilting in their favor. Even if a convoy emergency forced them to risk a group of corvettes in a difficult operation, the worst case, losing one or two of them, was still, in sheer economic terms, less damaging than allowing multiple merchant ships to go down. A cargo vessel might carry food, fuel, tanks, aircraft parts. The value of those contents, plus the cost of the hull itself, often exceeded that of an escort. By 1943, the combined effect of increased escort coverage, improved tactics, and support from long-range aircraft began to show clearly in the Atlantic statistics. Submarine sinkings rose. Merchant losses, while still serious, started to decline from their earlier peaks. Convoys that might once have expected to lose several ships on a crossing sometimes made the journey with all hulls intact. Corvettes were not the only reason for this shift, but they were an essential part of it. Their constant presence allowed escort groups to form outer and inner rings, to rotate ships between probing for contacts and staying close to the convoy. When a wolf pack formed and attacked, there were simply more Allied hulls on the scene than in the dark months of 1940 and 1941. The key insight is that a single, highly capable ship cannot be in two places at once. It can brilliantly prosecute one contact while another slips past its sector. Multiple adequate ships, working together, may never match the pinnacle of performance of a top-class destroyer, but they make it vastly harder for the enemy to find undefended space. In that sense, the Corvette force turned the ocean from a hunting ground into a more crowded, less forgiving environment for submarines. As German losses mounted, strategic choices in Berlin changed. Operations became more cautious. Areas judged too heavily escorted were avoided. Boats spent more time evading aircraft and less time stalking convoys. The initiative, which had seemed firmly in U-boat hands in the early happy times, began to drift toward the Allies. The small flower-named ships, with their simple machinery and narrow mess decks, had helped to swing that balance. The financial story of the Corvette program often remains in the background of popular accounts, overshadowed by dramatic convoy battles. Yet it is crucial to understanding why this solution was adopted and how it allowed Britain to sustain a global war effort. Total expenditure on the programs that produced the Flower class and their close successors amounted to a modest fraction of overall naval spending. Spread over hundreds of hulls, the cost per ship remained low. These figures become more striking when set beside the hypothetical alternative, attempting to fill the escort gap using only full-size destroyers. Planners could run the numbers easily enough. Each ocean convoy ideally needed around 8 escorts to maintain a layered defense. Hundreds of such convoys sailed each year. Maintaining a force of several hundred destroyers dedicated solely to this role would have required both money and yard capacity on a scale far beyond what Britain could reasonably afford, while also building capital ships, carriers, and specialized vessels for other theaters. By opting for a mixed force, destroyers where their speed and firepower mattered most, corvettes and later frigates for the heavy daily lifting of convoy escort, the Admiralty avoided that bottleneck. Steel, labor, and money that might have been frozen in a smaller number of highly sophisticated ships were instead spread across a larger fleet of simpler escorts, with enough margin left to support campaigns in the Mediterranean, North Africa, and eventually the build-up for a return to Western Europe. The secondary effects of this choice ripple outward. Each Corvette program contract supported regional economies in shipbuilding towns that might otherwise have languished. Skills learned in wartime, welding, riveting, marine engineering, would later serve in civilian shipbuilding and other industries. The state's investment did not vanish when a particular ship reached the end of its service life. Much of it remained in the form of human knowledge. On the German side, the impact of Corvette-driven escort density forced shifts in strategy that played into Allied hands. When U-boat commanders found fewer soft convoys to attack, they became more dependent on carefully planned operations in limited areas, which in turn made it easier for Allied commanders to concentrate air and escort resources where they were most needed. The apparently modest decision to build hundreds of simple ships thus influenced the distribution of Allied air squadrons, surface groups, and even code-breaking priorities. It is also worth noting that the corvettes themselves evolved over time. Later variants improved seakeeping, added more effective anti-aircraft weapons, and rearranged internal spaces to ease some of the worst crew hardships. The basic philosophy remained the same: use commercial technology where possible, prioritize rapid construction, and accept that these ships are tools built for a specific, demanding job. By the time discussions about post-war reconstruction began, Britain's leaders could look back at the balance sheet of the naval war and see that the decision to embrace the corvette concept had saved not only tonnage and lives at sea, but also financial flexibility. Money not spent on an all-destroyer escort strategy could be directed to other needs: aircraft production, army equipment, and the complex logistics of operations like the Normandy landings. From that perspective, each corvette represented more than a single hull escorting a single convoy. It was part of a larger bargain: accept smaller, rougher ships in the escort role, and in return retain the ability to fight a global war without collapsing under the weight of naval construction bills. As the war progressed into its later years, the escort picture grew more layered. New types of ship entered service: longer-ranged frigates with better sonar and improved living conditions, purpose-built sloops designed from the start as anti-submarine escorts. Long-range patrol aircraft filled some of the gaps that had once allowed U-boats to attack on the surface in mid-ocean with little fear of aerial intervention. Yet even as these newer tools appeared, the older corvettes continued to ply their trade. Many were refitted rather than retired. Some were transferred to Allied navies, extending their useful life in different theaters. Their crews gained experience that made each patrolling day more effective than the last. Knowledge of how to interpret sonar returns, how to coordinate with other ships and aircraft, and how to position an escort screen in complex weather conditions accumulated voyage after voyage. Convoy reports from 1944 and 1945 often describe escort groups that combine several classes of ship. A frigate might take the lead in sweeping ahead, with corvettes guarding the immediate flanks and trailing sectors of the convoy. Aircraft would be called in when contacts seemed promising or particularly stubborn. The result was an escort web far thicker than anything imagined at the start of the conflict. For U-boat commanders, the change was stark. Early in the war, they sometimes approached convoys with a degree of optimism, knowing that a small escort force could be confused or overwhelmed by coordinated attacks. Later, even a well-planned wolf-pack operation risked heavy losses. Every submarine lost represented months of training and precious industrial effort. Eventually, the attrition became unsustainable. In this environment, corvettes played a role similar to that of infantry in a land campaign. Not glamorous, often unreported, but absolutely essential. They were the ever-present line that the enemy had to cross before striking at the more vulnerable elements behind. Their work rarely produced dramatic headlines. Most people on shore never learned the names of individual ships. But commanders in the Western approaches and at Allied headquarters understood exactly how much depended on those small, persistent escorts. By the final years of the conflict in Europe, some of the earliest flowers had already been through multiple refits and repairs. Their hulls carried the marks of Atlantic winters and repeated engagements. Paint wore thin on the bow where ice had been hacked away one too many times. Yet they continued to sail, sometimes accompanying the very merchantmen that had benefited from their presence for years. When a submarine threat appeared on the edge of a convoy's radar coverage or in a sonar room's headphones, the response was often led not by a shining new ship, but by one of these older, proven escorts, whose officers and crew had spent more time on the ocean's grey surface than many pilots had in the air. They had become, in every sense of the word, professionals at their specific, unglamorous craft. In the immediate post-war years, many corvettes went quietly into civilian service or to the breakers. Their names disappeared from active lists, their hulls cut down or converted for peacetime uses. A few survived as museum exhibits or training ships, reminders of a time when flower-named vessels stood between starvation and survival. Looking back, it is tempting to focus only on the numbers, the tonnage of shipping preserved, the submarines destroyed, the relative costs. Those figures are important. They show clearly why a ship that cost roughly 1/10 of a destroyer could still be central to defeating the U-boat campaign. But the deeper lesson lies in the kind of thinking that made those numbers possible. Before the war, much naval planning revolved around ideals: the perfect destroyer, the most advanced cruiser, the most powerful battleship. In the Atlantic campaign, Britain was forced to accept a different view. Perfection that arrives too late is a luxury. In a struggle where every month of continued resistance matters, the best weapon is the one that you can build now, in quantity, with the resources and skills available. The Corvette embodied that principle. It was not fast enough to impress on a specification sheet, nor comfortable enough to attract volunteers for its living conditions alone. It did not carry the largest guns or the latest propulsion technology. What it did carry was a sonar set, depth charges, and a crew willing to accept hardship in exchange for doing a clear, vital job. Multiplied by hundreds, those modest capabilities became a force that even the most determined submarine fleet could not ignore. In doing so, the Corvettes also challenged some assumptions about naval prestige. They showed that a navy's value is not measured only by its largest ships or most polished formations, but by its ability to match tools to tasks. Against massed submarines in wide oceans, a network of small, stubborn escorts proved more decisive than an extra squadron of sleek destroyers the country could not afford to build. For the sailors who served on them, the legacy is personal. Many remembered the rolling decks, the constant damp, the long watches in wind and spray. They also remembered the convoys that reached port, the freighters that did not become statistics, and the knowledge that their ship's presence on the horizon may have been the difference between a safe arrival and a silent disappearance. In the end, that is what ties the story back to the title. British corvettes cost a fraction of a destroyer, but they were never meant to compete with destroyers on a one-to-one basis. Their strength came from being numerous, available, and suited to the exact work the moment demanded. In the ledger of the Battle of the Atlantic, that combination allowed them to play a central role in sinking more U-boats than the larger, more glamorous ships that had once been seen as the primary instruments of sea power. Sometimes, victory at sea belongs not to the most impressive ship in the fleet, but to the small, resilient vessels that simply refuse to leave the convoy unguarded.